Welcome to the Bad Designs video. This is a companion piece and part 2 to Magic's most disliked decks, cards, and strategies, so if you haven't watched that video yet, I recommend doing so first. This video will examine specific card and deck designs and how they lead to or away from fun and interesting play patterns. This is also the video where I'll discuss my thoughts on why Blood Moon and Burn are so terrible, so stick around for some juicy controversy at the end. Dials and knobs. Let's talk about what these points will not be about, and that's cards that are bad exclusively because they're too powerful. For example, in Modern, cards like Hogak, Oko, and Skullclamp are obviously too good and are rightfully banned, but none of the mechanics on these cards are inherently problematic. Rather, it's more a matter of dials and knobs, tuning the numbers rightly or wrongly. Certain mechanics have historically been risky because they're more prone to creating overpowered cards if not properly balanced, the most prominent being anything that reduces or cheats on mana costs, the fundamental, most basic balancing tool of Magic. For example, delve cards like Hogak, Treasure Cruise, and Dig Through Time were too pushed, but no one is arguing that Sib-Sig Muckdraggers is broken. But what if instead of delving 8 cards, you only had to delve 3? It's not that delve itself is busted, but rather that it's more difficult to implement properly. So with all that glorious preamble out of the way, let's move on to bad card designs. To understand what makes these bad, we first have to look at what it is that players dislike. I would submit that a lot of the badness in these designs stems from at least one of the following. Literally can't play the game, i.e. stacks, can't interact with the opponent or interacting is too difficult, waiting, my toys don't work, or getting beat by your own cards, overly or unnecessarily random, no-brainers, and bad numbers. Let's start with waiting, or effectively wins but takes forever to do so. Probably the most hated type of design in Magic is stacks, also called prison or mana denial. In fact, looking at EDH Rec's most salt-inducing cards, most of them are stacks pieces. With stacks, players are left unable to do anything and have to just wait for their opponent to win the game. It's the waiting that's the key. Certain stacks combos win the game on the spot and are called hard locks. Think of things like Karn plus Mycosynth Lattice that prevent the opponent from tapping their lands for mana. Outside of very specific answers, the game isn't technically over, but it basically is. If your opponent locks you with this, you may as well just concede, the same way you'd concede versus any other combo deck like Splinter Twin. The real problem arises when you have soft locks. These are stacks cards and combos that, while making it incredibly difficult for the opponent to do anything, don't technically stop them outright. These are cards like massed land destruction spells such as Armageddon, Winter Orb, Trinisphere, and so on. This principle also applies to non-stack situations such as when a player is empty-handed and has no board presence and their opponent continuously +2s Jace the Mind Sculptor to Fate Seal away any relevant cards. Soft locks are a problem because, unlike hard locks where your opponent has effectively won the game and not conceding is just wasting time, under a soft lock, it's technically correct to continue playing the game even if you're only 1% to get out of your predicament. This means being demoralized, repeatedly passing the turn back to your opponent since you can't do anything, and crossing your fingers that you can somehow luck your way out of the situation, but knowing that you'll most likely lose. And as I stated, this kind of gameplay applies to more than just stacks. Value engines like Jace and Teferi that continuously draw more cards at no cost beyond their initial investment create a snowball effect where one player slips further behind as each turn passes without them finding an answer. More goes into bad Planeswalker design, but I'll speak about that later. Extra turn spells are disliked, particularly in EDH. The problem isn't the first extra turn, it's the many more that follow from casting additional extra turn spells or looping them with regrowth effects like Eternal Witness. Now, sometimes this is an infinite combo, like Ewit plus Time Warp plus Ephemerate, and you can feel free to concede. But other times it's essentially a stacks-esque soft lock where you have to sit around, twiddling your thumbs, waiting for the opponent to either win or run out of extra turns, often leaving them way ahead anyway. There are also combos that induce waiting because they require tons of game actions to actually win, the classic example being Storm decks. While some combos are simple A plus B equals win, like Splinter Twin, where you can just demonstrate an infinite loop, others are like Storm or Eggs that require casting rituals to get mana, to cast cantrips, to get more rituals, to get more card draw, to find tutors, to find Past in Flames or Underworld Breach, to flashback your spells to cast them again, and on it goes until they finally win 15 minutes later. It's important to note that even in situations with decks like Storm or Lotus Field, where their win is 100% assured based on the resources they present and it'll simply take a while to go through the motions, it's still technically incorrect to concede early since there's always a small chance of pilot error messing them up. For example, one time I was playing against Amulet Titan. They were on the play, and on turn 2, put 2 amulets into play and proceeded to make a bananas amount of mana, then cast 2 Summoner's Pacts and put 2 Primeval Titans into play. Now at this point, I could have just conceded, but I let them play it out. They fetched the incorrect lands, pumped both Titans and gave them haste, and attacked for 16, leaving me at 4 life and leaving themselves without enough mana to pay for the 2 pacts next turn. Non-Interactible cards. Magic is not solitaire. The game involves at least 2 players and therefore necessarily requires interaction between them, but when interaction is impossible or too difficult, things become frustrating. Typical Magic is a back and forth. One player deploys a threat, the other player answers that threat or deploys one of their own. Each player takes it in turn to deploy and answer threats, and therefore the game is a two-way street. The problem is when this balance gets disrupted. The classic example is creatures with hexproof or protection, which are particularly frustrating to deal with because they can't be answered normally, and while there are always ways around this, such as edicts or sweepers, those answers tend to be too niche or ineffective against most other cards. A positive trend we can see is Wizards' designs moving away from hexproof and protection and towards ward, since demanding a cost to interact is better than being unable to interact. A similar case of non-interaction is with decks that win via lands or stack-based combos, oftentimes employing big spell finishers. Examples of these decks are Lotus Field, Scape Shift, and Storm. Outside of blue counterspells, the other colors typically can't interact with spells on the stack, making things like Rituals and Do Emergent Ultimatum difficult to deal with for non-blue decks. And take decks that win via lands like Lotus Field or Valakut. Wizards knows that players dislike mana denial, which means they typically don't print efficient land hate. I agree that mana denial is unfun, but it becomes a problem when land-based win cons can't be efficiently answered. The various attempts at designing non-salt-inducing answers are often not good enough, such as Field of Ruin. Both competitive and random. Randomness and skill aren't mutually exclusive, and I think a certain amount of randomness can actually make a game more interesting. Without it, you get chess, which is boring since it's devolved into a known set of specific, optimal sequences, and less skilled players will never have any shot of beating better players. But I think card games like Magic have enough randomness already. As I said in the last video, there are already multiple points of variance at play. What deck did you choose before arriving at the tournament? How does it fare against your opponent's decks, and what order do you face them in? Who's on the play and draw? What cards are in your opening hand and in your opponent's? Do you or your opponent need to mulligan, and if so, what's in the new hands? What cards do you each draw as the game advances, in what order, and how do they line up against each other? I'm not necessarily opposed to any form of additional variance. Technically, any spell that draws a card is adding more variance since the card drawn is random, but I think that in general, additional randomness is bad, especially the more random and the more impactful the outcome becomes. One example of this is Collected Company, but this applies to any card that chooses among a restrictive criteria from a small set of cards. There are times when Coco is incredible and puts 6 mana worth of exactly what you need into play, and other times where you find only a single mana dork or brick entirely. This can happen regardless of whether you build your deck with the optimal number of 3-cost and lower creatures. Another example of randomness is Comet Stellar Pup in Legacy. While all of Comet's abilities are generically useful in terms of generating value, they're not equally useful, and circumstances change how good they are. There's also the widely disparate outcomes. You can get unlucky and suicide Comet by hitting the loyalty minusing numbers back to back, or you can roll 6, double up on value, and put Comet to a ridiculous loyalty count. Even small incremental effects matter. Grist the Hunger Tides Plus ability has a small rider on it that doubles its effect when the random card you mill over is an insect, which usually means when you mill one of the other 3 Grists in your deck. Chances are this won't happen 99% of the time, but in the 1% of the time that it does happen, getting an extra insect token can mean the difference between having enough blockers for Grist or having additional fodder for Chord of Calling or Yawgmoth. I've spoken a lot about Ragavan already, but the worst aspect of it is the random exile effect, which can be a worthless land or a card that single-handedly determines the game, like 3 Fairy for example. Even in the case where it's a land, it can still be annoying if you're short on lands and Ragavan keeps exiling them. It's hard to convey the feeling of how frustrating it is when you lose a game to this sort of variance, bricking on Coco, your opponent getting that extra Grist hit, or Ragavan stealing something pivotal. I've played a game using Amulet Titan and playing against a Ragavan deck where the Ragavan hit and exiled both Valakuts out of the deck back to back. In contrast, let's look at Dark Confidant. Bob draws you an extra card each turn and loses life depending on the mana value of the random card you reveal. In practice, this means any deck that runs Dark Confidant is going to keep the mana values of the other cards as low as possible. I'm personally fine with this level of variance, but I think in general, randomness on competitively viable cards should be kept to a minimum. Planeswalkers. I think amongst all of Magic's cards, Planeswalkers are consistently the most poorly designed and frustrating cards in the game. The reasons are too much starting loyalty, meaning you can't effectively attack them, plus or zero abilities that add value at no cost, such as drawing cards, killing creatures, or making tokens, and ultimates, powerful abilities that require a large minus in loyalty that single-handedly win the game on their own, creating a Protect the Queen subgame. Now, it should be noted that this doesn't apply to all Planeswalkers, in fact, not even most of them. At the time of this video's creation, there are 274 unique Planeswalkers, and out of those, only 27 of them see regular play in competitive 1v1 formats. I counted, and here they are. That's 10%. But Magic and formats aren't defined by the majority of well or at least passably designed cards, but rather by the few horrible outliers. That's why players can dislike Modern Horizons 1 solely due to Hogak and Astrolabe, even though most cards in that set are actually well-designed, interesting, and fun. The competitively viable Planeswalkers have too much starting loyalty, especially those under 4 mana. They often start with or can immediately plus to 4 loyalty, putting them out of bolt range and above any attacks by whatever small creatures the other player may have deployed in the early turns. Having plus or zero abilities that continuously generate value like drawing cards, removal, or making tokens is ridiculous. Probably the most prominent among these cards are Jace the Mind Sculptor and Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, but this applies to many others. If you think about other card types, like creatures or enchantments for example, there really aren't any cards in the game that do the same thing. The closest equivalents are the black cards like Phyrexian Arena, Dark Confidant, and Bitter Blossom, and even those have life loss as a drawback. The previous two issues are then made all the worse by ultimates. If your opponent plays a big beater like Tarmogoyf, Murktide, or Death Shadow and you don't have removal, you can probably tank a few hits before finding a removal spell to deal with them. But if you're in the same situation against Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, every turn you don't answer it is a turn they pull further ahead on cards, and if enough time elapses, you'll lose to the ultimate. Even in the case where you manage to kill a walker before it ultimates, they're often so far ahead of you by then that it doesn't matter anymore. The value Planeswalkers provide and their ability to ultimate is so great, it means you often have to overcommit resources to getting rid of them, which can involve making bad attacks or wasting burn spells just to keep them off high enough loyalty. For examples of good Planeswalker designs, the uncommon War of the Spark Planeswalkers like Kiora that only have finite minus abilities are good. The Wandering Emperor is also an excellent example of a very good but still balanced card. It generates tokens and kills creatures, but these are both minus abilities and it has to plus again before using them. It also doesn't have an ultimate. Frankly, I don't know why ultimate abilities started, but they should be permanently retired, and any loyalty ability that gets rid of permanents, draws cards, or create tokens should be a minus. Extraneous Text. These are extra abilities tacked onto already good cards that are simply unnecessary. It's especially bad if they're relevant so little of the time that you forget about them and they turn into gotcha moments. For example, let's look at Bonecrusher Giant. Take a look at the Stomp Adventure mode. Notice anything? I'll give you a moment. This Bonecrusher is actually a lie, a fake I edited. The real Bonecrusher looks like this. If you didn't remember that Stomp has an anti-damage prevention clause, there's no shame in that since it basically never comes up, so why is it there in the first place? Another card like this is Murktide Regent, where the card was already good enough without that fourth ability, which usually just acts as a gotcha for players who forget about it. Beating you with your own toys, aka Theft Effect. Many players despise having cards in their library exiled or milled. They also dislike theft effects where the opponent steals control of their creatures or exiles and casts spells from their deck. There's something deeply psychological going on for which I'm not qualified to analyze, but basically, players don't want to lose access to their cards during the game even if they didn't draw them, and especially don't want their cards used against them. I find this is particularly the case in casual EDH. These types of cards are also problematic because they break the color pie. They nearly always include a qualifier that you can spend mana of any type or color to cast stolen spells, or they get around it in other ways, such as how Ragavan provides its own treasures. One extremely salt-inducing card that comes up as a prime example of multiple bad design choices is the popular EDH card Expropriate. It's a big spell finisher, meaning non-blue decks can't interact with it, and it both takes extra turns and steals things. linear decks, and sideboarding where only one card matters. Another bad play pattern occurs with linear decks and sideboard cards that single-handedly answer them. Example would be things like Cascade and Chalice of the Void or Dredge and Rest in Peace. In these matches, the only thing that matters is whether the linear deck's opponent draws the Silver Bullet sideboard card, and then whether they can answer it or not. I think this is more a problem with how some linear strategies are so powerful, fast, and efficient that the only reasonable answer to them are cards that completely shut them down. I think a situation like Dredge versus Relic of Progenitus, where timing and holding up mana matters and where the Dredge player can rebuild after Relic gets popped, is far more interesting than Dredge versus Rest in Peace, where they either draw enchantment removal or lose. To be frank though, I don't know how you would solve this since it seems like a systemic problem caused by Wizards printing too many powerful linear cards. Incidental land hate. Cards where the primary use isn't eliminating lands, but they can incidentally do that as well. These are usually expensive cards that are designed to be big bombs, but the problem is that when you stick land hate onto them, ramp decks suddenly have the ability to turn into Stax decks. The best example is Karn Liberated, which can exile any permanent including lands. Karn would be a lot more tolerable if it couldn't end the game on the spot by hitting lands. Decision making and card balance, no-brainers, and cards that are good at everything or good at all points in the game. Games of Magic are more interesting when you have meaningful decisions to make. Looking at Narset, Three Fairy, and Karn the Great Creator, these cards mostly get flack for their obnoxious static abilities, but another big problem with them I think is their ability to minus without dying. For example, if Three Fairy only started with 3 loyalty, it would be a serious decision whether to use it immediately and lose it, or plus instead and gamble on it surviving to the next turn. At 4 loyalty, minusing immediately is a no-brainer. Yet other cards are problems because they have no drawbacks, are good at every point in the game, or have no counterplay. The poster child for this is Uro. For 3 mana, Uro draws a card, gains life, and ramps. In the early game, gaining life and ramping helps stabilize to the mid and late game, and drawing a card is good whenever. Then, Uro eventually becomes a giant recursive threat that continuously generates value. On top of this, it's hard to interact with since you need exile-based removal or graveyard hate to get rid of it permanently. So, taking these points one at a time. Good at all points is in contrast to cards like Mana Dorks such as Birds of Paradise. Mana Dorks are good early when you want to ramp, but they're liabilities later when you already have enough mana and you're in top deck mode. A famous Magic dichotomy attributed to Patrick Chapin is that all creatures should either be Muldrifters or Baneslayers. In terms of card design, this means you can either generate value or be a threat, but not both. This is one of the reasons Planeswalker design is so egregious and is an issue when you get cards like Uro that do everything. Time-wasting cards. Lastly are cards found mostly in EDH that don't accomplish much beyond wasting a lot of time without actually advancing the game towards a conclusion. The classic example of a time waster is Shahrazad, and it's no wonder she's been banned everywhere, but other cards that follow in the same time-wasting philosophy exist, such as Thieves' Auction and Scrambleverse. Didn't I say I was going to talk about Blood Moon and Burn? The OG Stax 3, Blood Moon, Chalice of the Void, and Ensnaring Bridge. Let me take you back to a modern long ago, before Modern Horizons. Blood Moon, Chalice, and Bridge made up a trinity of loathed Stax cards that many players felt should be banned. Nowadays, there's been a lot of efficient removal printed for artifacts such as Force of Vigor and agnostic white removal like Leyline Binding. But even back then, Chalice and Bridge didn't stop the opponent from playing the game. Even if their deck was built primarily around attacking with creatures or consisted mostly of 1-mana spells, they could still draw cards and tap their lands normally. Even in the cases where they didn't have main deck answers, the sideboard would oblige. For example, speaking in today's terms, let's take a look at Chalice versus Murktide decks. Chalice, while definitely good against them, still doesn't stop many of their spells. Murktide, Ledger Shredder, Expressive Iteration, and Counterspell all still get around it. The same is true for other decks like Burn that have a surprisingly substantial pool of cards that get around a Chalice on 1. Blood Moon, however, is uniquely awful in how it completely shuts down the ability of a player to actually play the game, and it leads to the most non-games of any card I've ever seen. But first, let's examine the arguments for it. Point 1. Blood Moon helps keep unfair land-based decks in check like Tron, Amulet Titan, and Creativity. It's the best card by far for fighting obnoxious lands like Urza's Saga, Lotus Field, and Valakut. Point 2. It punishes 3+ color decks that rely on greedy multicolor mana bases. Between fetches, shocks, and triomes, Modern's mana has become free in a sense, and Moon pushes back against that. Point 3. Just fetch basics. I'm more sympathetic to fighting the unfair decks, but I think other cards like Damping Sphere already exist and work well enough. For the greedy decks, sure they're greedy, but what are they supposed to do against Blood Moon? That's how they're built. It's the same argument as Lifebane Zombie back in Magic 2014. Wizards printed Lifebane Zombie, a card that hated on white and green decks, and rather than being a sideboard card only or just a removal spell, Lifebane was good enough to mainboard in black decks since it was both a solid body with evasion and also hand disruption. It might seem quaint by the power crept standards of today, but back then this was a problem. The argument for it was that Lifebane was simply another in a long line of perfectly fine color hosers. However, in an article at the time, Wizards argued that if you were playing a white-green deck, what were you supposed to do? Just not play white and green cards? That's what your deck is. They went on to say that they would stop printing these types of hosers. Anyway, there are decks which don't play fetches. Even the decks that do can't always fetch basics, especially in the early game if they're using a multicolor mana base and need to fetch shocks or triumphs to cast their spells. Many decks use Blood Moon as a plan B, which cripples the ability of their opponent to sideboard properly. For example, if you're playing a deck that's vulnerable to Blood Moon and you're against Rhinos, can you really even afford to bring Force of Vigor into that match? Force is useless against the rest of their deck, and they might not even draw Moon. In many cases, Blood Moon is a 3-mana card that solo carries the game. It also represents the worst play patterns of Stax decks, where the player under the Moon Lock has to continue to play a dragged out game on the slim chance they can naturally draw a basic land and a removal spell they can cast for Moon. It should be noted that this is uniquely a problem for Modern, and that Blood Moon isn't nearly as bad in Legacy, although I'd argue that Moon is still the worst of the Stax cards there too. Even cards like Back to Basics or Winter Orb still give you access to some mana. Wasteland is also not nearly as bad since it's only a 1-for-1 and also puts the Wasteland-er a land behind. Legacy is also different in a number of ways. Spells are cheaper and include many 1-mana cantrips. Force of Will and Daze are free answers to Moon, and the main reason degenerate combo decks don't singularly dominate the format. There are more alternative ways around Moon, such as Crow Mox and Mox Diamond, and players are playing more basic lands and are more prepared to fetch them because of the presence of Wasteland. So for all of those reasons, that's why I dislike Blood Moon so much. Lastly, we come to Burn. I've already discussed my dislike of Burn in the Modern Guide video on it, but I'll go over my points again here as well as expanding on them. Burn suffers from a unique problem where the issue isn't so much that any one card in the deck is too good, except Eidolon, but rather that the critical mass of all the cards put together is the issue. Burn is a fast aggro deck that typically wins around turn 3 or 4, and if it was just that alone, I think it would be fine. I'm generally fine with aggro decks like Hammer Time and Infect. After all, I understand the game in those circumstances. You're playing fast, cheap creatures that are trying to attack me, and I need removal spells or blockers to stop you. In Hammer's case, additional sideboard cards that hit artifacts or enchantments are also effective. But for Burn, it's uniquely troublesome because of how it attacks from multiple angles, employing both fast creatures with haste and straight-to-the-face burn spells. Blockers and removal do nothing against the latter. Another problem is how sideboarding against Burn is often untenable. Let's say you have Blood Moon in your sideboard to fight Tron. Moon isn't only effective against Tron though, it hits every other deck that relies on lands, Amulet Titan, Scape Shift, 4-color Elementals, Hammer Time, etc. The same cross-usage of sideboard cards doesn't apply to Burn. In Burn's case, while there are some cards that have multiple uses, such as Chalice of the Void, the only surefire way to combat it is life gain, and the problem is that life gain isn't useful anywhere else, including against other aggro decks. The final thing that puts Burn over the top for me in terms of its dislikability is Eidolon of the Great Revel. Eidolon is number 2 on my most disliked cards list, right under Blood Moon. It has a similar effect in that if you can't answer it immediately, it often means you just lose the game on the spot and at only 2 mana. After all, if you don't have removal, what are you supposed to do? Just not cast your spells? However, things have gotten better regarding Burn since its heyday. There's now multiple commonly played answers to Eidolon that don't trigger it, including Leyline Binding, Solitude, and Fury. Omnath is also one of the most played creatures in the format, and its life gain ability can single-handedly beat Burn, so there's that. And so with that, it's a wrap. That concludes the video, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you to my supporters, and if you enjoy these videos, consider subscribing or supporting the channel on Patreon, and take care.